Intro time to the Book of the Dead. Alright, we're going to start reading a new book. Alright, so this one is the Egyptian Book of the Dead. This is their religious book, and beginning of Exodus, where were we escaping from? These gods. So, let's learn about them, be mindful of them, spot them in our current predicament, because, God gave these creatures or beings or deities the name of God, Elohims. He didn't say that on accident. There are other powers at B that are more powerful than humans. There is only one living God. Only one. But anyway, so the history of the great body of religious compositions which form the Book of the Dead of the ancient Egyptians may conveniently be divided into four of the periods, which are represented by four versions. The version which was edited by the priest of the College of Anu, the aunt of the Bible and the Heliopolis of the Greeks, and which was based upon a series of texts now lost, but which there is no evidence to prove had passed through a series of revisions or editions as early as the period of the 5th dynasty. This version was, so far as we know, also written in hieroglyphs and may be called the Heliopolitan version. It is known from the 5 copies which are inscribed upon the walls of the chambers and passages of the pyramids of kings of the 5th and 6th dynasties at Saqqara, and the sections of it are found inscribed upon tombs, sarcophagi, coffins, stelae, and papyri from the 11th dynasty to about AD or 200 AD. You guys can slow it down if you wanted to read all the sources. I'm not reading all that to you guys. I'm sorry. Alright, second version. The Theban version, which was commonly written on papyri and hieroglyphics, was divided into sections or chapters, each of which had its distinct title but no definite place in the series. The version was much used from the 13th to 20th dynasty. Third version, a version closely allied to preceding version, which is found written on papyri in the hieratic character and also in hieroglyphics. In this version, which came into use about the 20th dynasty, the chapters have no fixed order. The so-called Sate version, in which at some period anterior probably to the 26th dynasty, the chapters were arranged in a definite order. It is commonly written in hieroglyphics and in hieratic, and it was much used from the 16th dynasty to the end of the Ptolemaic period. Early forms of the Book of the Dead. The Book of the Dead. The earliest inscribed monuments and human remains found in Egypt prove that the ancient Egyptians took the utmost care to preserve the bodies of their dead by various processes of embalming. The deposit of the body in the tomb was accompanied by ceremonies of a symbolic nature, in the course of which certain compositions comprising prayers, short litanies, have reference to the future life, were recited or chanted by priests and relatives on behalf of the dead. The greatest importance was attached to such compositions in the belief that the recital would secure for the dead an unhindered passage to God in the next world, would enable him to overcome the opposition of all ghostly foes, would endow his body in the tomb with power to resist corruption, and would ensure him a new life in a glorified body in heaven. At a very remote period, certain groups of sections or chapters had already become associated with some of the ceremonies which preceded actual burial, and these eventually became a distinct ritual with clearly defined limits. Side by side, however, with this ritual, there seems to have existed another larger work, which was divided into an indefinite number of sections or chapters comprising chiefly prayers, and which dealt on a large scale with the welfare of the departed in the next world, and described the state of existence there and the dangers which must be passed successfully before it could be reached, and was found generally on the religious dogmas and mythology of the Egyptians. The title of Book of the Dead is usually given by Egyptologists to the editions of the larger work which were made in the 13th and following dynasties, but in this introduction, the term is intended to include the general body of texts which have reference to the burial of the dead and to the new life in the world beyond the grave, and which are known to have existed in revised editions and to have been in use among the Egyptians from about 4500 BC to early centuries of the Christian era. The home origin and early history of the collection of ancient religious texts which have descended to us are at present unknown, and all working theories regarding them, however strongly supported by apparently well ascertained facts, must be carefully distinguished as theories, so long as single and ancient necropolis in Egypt remains unexplored and its inscriptions are untranslated, whether they composed by the inhabitants of Egypt who recorded them in hieroglyphic characters and who have left the monuments, which are the only trustworthy source of information on the subject, or whether they were brought into Egypt in the early immigrants from the East Asiatic continent whence they came, or whether they represent the religious books of the Egyptians incorporated with the funeral text of some prehistoric dwellers on the banks of the Nile, are all questions which the possible discovery of inscriptions belonged to the first dynasties of the early empire can alone decide. The evidence derived from an enormous mass of new material which we owe to the all-important discovery of his mastaba tombs and pyramids by M. Maspero and to his publication of the early religious texts proves beyond all doubt that the greater part of the texts comprised in the Book of the Dead are far older than the period of Mena, the first historical king of Egypt. Certain sections indeed appear to belong to an indefinitely remote and primeval time. The earliest text bears within themselves proofs not only of having been composed, but also of having been revised or edited long before the days of King Meni, and judging from many passages in the copied inscribed in the hieroglyphics upon the pyramids of Unas, it would seem that even at the remote date the scribes were perplexed and hardly understood the text which they had before them. The most moderate estimate makes certain sections of the Book of the Dead as known from these tombs older than 3,000 years before Christ. We are in any case justified in estimating the earliest form of the word to be contemporaneous with the foundation of the civilization which we call Egyptian in the valley of. Once again, you guys can read all this. Value of the Nile to fix a chronological limit for the arts and civilization of Egypt is absolutely impossible. The oldest form or edition of the Book of the Dead as we have received it supplies no information whatever as to the period when it was compiled, but a copy of the heretic text inscribed upon a coffin of the Mintu Hedik, a queen of the 11th dynasty about 2500 BC, made by the late Sir J.G. Wilkinson, informs us that the chapter which, according to the arrangement of Lepsius, bears the number LXIV, was discovered in the reign of Hesped on the fifth king of the first dynasty, about BC or 4266 BC. On this coffin are two copies of the chapter, the one immediately following the other, in the rubric to the first name of the king during whose reign the chapter is said to have been found is given as Mentuhotep, which, as Goodwin first pointed out, is a mistake for Menkaura, the fourth king of the fourth dynasty about BC. 3633 BC, but in the rubric to the second, the king's name is given as Hespedi. Thus, it appears that in the period of the 11th dynasty, it was believed that the chapter might alternatively be as old as the time of the first dynasty. Further, it is given to a Hespedi in papyri of the 21st dynasty, a period when particular attention was paid to the history of the Book of the Dead, and it thus appears that the Egyptians in the Middle Empire believed the chapter to date from the more remote period. To quote the words of Chabas, the chapter was regarded as being very ancient, very mysterious, and very difficult to understand, already 14 centuries before our era. The rubric on the coffin of Queen Mentuhotep, which ascribes the chapter of Hespedi, states that this chapter was found on the foundations beneath the Hinu boat for the forming of the builders in the time of the king of the north and the south, Hespedi triumph. The Nebseni papyrus says this chapter was found in the city of Chiminu on a block of iron stone written in letters of lapis lazuli under the feet of the god, and the Turin papyrus adds that the name of the finder was Hero-Tutuf, the son of Chufu or Cheops, the second king of the fourth dynasty about 733 BC, who was at the time marking a tour of inspection of the temples. Birch and Neville consider the chapter 1 of the oldest of the Book of the Dead, the former basing his opinion on the rubric and the later upon the evidence derived from the contents and characters of the text, but Maspero, while admitting the great age of the chapter, does not attach any great importance to the rubric as fixing any exact date for its composition. Of Herotuth, the finder of the block of stone, we know that later texts that he was considered to be a learned man, and that his speech was only with difficulty to be understood. And we also know the prominent part which he took as a recognized man of letters in bringing to the court of the father of Chufu, the sage of Tita. It is then not improbable that Hirotuf's character for learning may have suggested the connection of his name with the chapter, and possibly as its literary revisor, at all events as early as the period of the Middle Empire tradition associated with him. Now you can read all this again. Pause it all you want, but